In this lecture, we're going to review the role of the pancreas as an endocrine organ. And the unique aspect of the pancreas is that it functions both as an exocrine organ and an endocrine organ. An exocrine organ or gland is one that will produce secretions, it will generate molecules as well as mucus and deliver those secretions directly into one anatomical location. One example of the pancreas's role as an exocrine gland is that the pancreas will produce what is called pancreatic juices, and in doing so will deliver these secretions directly into the digestive system. But in this unit, we're going to focus on the pancreas as an endocrine gland, and portions of the pancreas exist as what are called pancreatic islets. Pancreatic islets are small clusters of cells that makes up approximately 1 to 2% of the pancreas and contains approximately 500,000 to a million of these clusters. And these islets go by the term islets of Langerhans, named after Paul Langerhans, the individual who is credited with the discovery of these islets and quantified and characterized these small clusters of cells. And what's unique about these clusters of cells is that these cells are made up of unique, what are called alpha cells. And alpha cells are cells that will produce a protein that functions as a hormone. That protein is glucagon. And the function of glucagon is that it will trigger an increase in blood glucose. And to increase blood glucose, glucose has to be secreted from another organ. That organ is the liver. In doing so, glucagon will bind to liver cells and generate an increase in what is called glycogenolysis. So the storage form of glucose inside the body is in the form of liver glycogen, and liver glycogen, when broken down, will result in individual glucose molecules to be broken off and allowed to freely enter the cardiovascular system. A second batch of cells are referred to as beta cells, and these beta cells secrete another protein referred to as insulin. And the function of insulin is to decrease blood glucose levels. In doing so, insulin will bind to cells, specifically liver cells and muscle cells, and will trigger those cells to remove glucose molecules from the cardiovascular system, and those glucose molecules will enter these cells. A third type of cell found within the islets of Langerhans are what are called delta cells. And delta cells secrete a compound referred to as somatostatin, and somatostatin will function to inhibit both insulin and glucagon secretion, and as a result will assist the pancreas itself to regulate the amount of these two proteins that are produced and secreted into the cardiovascular system. In this graphic here, we're going to go through the steps in which the body produces insulin and glucagon in an alternating manner. And this begins when a person consumes a food that has a digestible carbohydrate in the form of sugar or starch. And when a person does consume that digestible carbohydrate, the individual glucose molecules will be broken away from each other and will be absorbed from the digestive system and into the cardiovascular system. As a result, blood glucose levels will increase, and the glucose will bind to beta cells in the pancreas and induce the beta cells in the pancreas to produce and secrete a protein called insulin. Insulin will get into the cardiovascular system, will travel throughout the body, and will bind to both liver cells and skeletal muscle cells, and in doing so, will trigger those cells to remove glucose from the cardiovascular system and into those cells for storage. And as a result, blood glucose levels will return back to homeostatic levels. However, in order to prevent the excessive removal of glucose from the cardiovascular system, which is triggered by insulin, the resulting lower levels of glucose in the blood will also trigger alpha cells to produce glucagon and secrete glucagon into the cardiovascular system, where glucagon will then target liver cells and will trigger those liver cells to break up the storage form of glucose as glycogen, and the small blue elements here indicate glucose molecules that have been freed chemically from other glucose molecules will move into the cardiovascular system and restore blood glucose back to homeostatic levels. So what we see here is an alternating secretion of insulin and glucagon in order to prevent either too much of an increase in blood glucose levels or too much of a decrease in blood glucose levels. And that leads to a characterization and quantification of the effect of different foods have on the physiological response to carbohydrate feeding. And that leads us to the glycemic index. And the glycemic index is a numerical value that tracks how fast blood glucose goes up following the ingestion of a digestible carbohydrate in a particular food item. And so the glycemic index is affected by a number of different factors. The first factor is reflected by how much of a particular food is made up of carbohydrates. And so with an increase in carbohydrate concentration or percent of that food, that particular food will have a higher glycemic index. So just some examples here is that ice cream, for example, has a glycemic index of 61. A boiled potato has a glycemic index of 85, so a much higher glycemic index, and instant rice has an even higher glycemic index value. The higher value, which suggests that the consumption of one serving of instant rice compared to ice cream will cause a faster rise in blood glucose levels. And so what we see here is that the proportion of instant rice compared to ice cream is much higher in terms of the carbohydrate concentration than we have with other foods, and in this case, ice cream. The type of carbohydrate consumed will also affect how fast blood glucose increases in the blood following the consumption of that meal. So we examine simple carbohydrates, which are sugars, versus complex carbohydrates that are digestible, which is starch, will appear faster in the cardiovascular system with those simple carbohydrates because it's easier for the digestive system to digest that food and to absorb the glucose molecules. One of the indirect effects here of consuming a diet high in simple carbohydrates or sugars is that it will cause a faster and higher secretion of insulin. One of the effects of insulin, in addition to decreasing blood glucose levels, is that insulin will also contribute to an increase in fat storage in adipocytes. And so by having a greater amount of insulin being secreted to manage a higher level of blood glucose following the consumption of a sugar-containing food, that insulin will also stimulate fat cells to store more fatty acids. And in terms of cooking, the application of heat to a food that contains a digestible carbohydrate will disrupt the chemical bonds holding the glucose molecules together. That will enable faster digestion of that food. Uh, Faster digestion of that food will lead to a faster increase in blood glucose levels, and that will cause a faster response from the pancreas. And so, coming back to the proportion of the carbohydrate content in the ingested food here, we see that the major reason in which food such as instant rice has a higher glycemic index than ice cream is that in instant rice and a boiled potato, the vast majority of those molecules are in the form of starch. Ice cream contains a high percentage of fat, higher than the boiled potato or instant rice, and as a result, the simultaneous ingestion of fat with the ice cream will interfere with the absorption of the glucose molecules. And to present a graphic response we see here in terms of the blood glucose response to the consumption of two different foods, we'll examine the blood glucose concentration response over time. One other measure in terms of quantifying the effects of consuming carbohydrates on blood glucose is not just the glycemic index, but the glycemic load. And the glycemic load takes into consideration not just how fast blood glucose shows up in the cardiovascular system following the consumption of a particular food, but it also considers how much how much carbohydrates are contained in that food. And in fact, when both factors are taken into consideration, the glycemic load is actually considered to have a greater predictive value for risk factors to develop type 2 diabetes mellitus and cardiovascular disease. And so to depict this response of blood glucose following the consumption of a meal graphically, here we see with the blue arrow indicating the consumption of some food. Now that food has to have a digestible carbohydrate in it. And we see that following the consumption of that food, not that long after, we see an increase in blood glucose as that food is digested and glucose molecules move from the digestive system and into the cardiovascular system. At some point, that blood glucose will reach a peak level and will then start to move in the opposite direction back to homeostatic levels. And that's going to be generated by the secretion of insulin from the pancreas. What we see here in the dotted blue line, here we see a similar response, but it differs in terms of how fast blood glucose goes up and how high blood glucose goes up. And so the slope of this blood glucose response over time is indicative of the glycemic index. And so the speed, we see blood glucose going up very, very fast. That's going to be a product of the digestibility and the relative proportion of carbohydrate in that food source. When we take a look at the magnitude of the increase, that will be more reflected by the glycemic load. So if we only focus on the glycemic index is characterized by the slope of that upward trend in blood glucose levels. We see a very steep slope, not as steep a slope we see here for this food item, but the magnitude of the peak level of blood glucose will be characterized by the glycemic load. And so in keeping consistent with the example on the previous slide, the red line here would be a reflection of consuming one serving of ice cream compared to consuming one serving of instant rice in the blue line. The instant rice had a glycemic index value of 91, whereas the ice cream had a value of 61. So the consumption of one serving of instant rice is going to cause the blood glucose levels to go up much faster because it is easily digested and is composed almost entirely of glucose molecules. So this ends this lecture on our introduction to the pancreatic hormones.